Hey, AP European History students, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm back with you for Unit 2, The Age of Reformation from 1450 to 1648. I'm going to be using the Key Concepts Study Guide that was produced by the College Board. I'll be reading through it, making commentary on it, and of course bringing in some visual aids, hitting some geography, to try to put it into some context for you. To start off with, I just kind of like to remind AP European History students of the general timeline and key ideas that are covered in this class. If you look at this little visual aid here in front of you, you'll notice that there are 4 basic time periods that are covered in this European history class, from 1450 up to the present time. And within each of these time periods, there are topical units. The first one is the Renaissance and Exploration, and the second one is the Age of Reformation that happens within time period number 1. What I mean by that is that at the same time as the Renaissance was going on, towards the end of the Renaissance, there was the beginning of the Reformation. So there is definitely an overlap between the Renaissance, at least the later Renaissance, and the Age of Reformation. I like to point out to my students that about the same year that Leonardo da Vinci was painting his famous Mona Lisa was about the same time that Martin Luther was tacking up his 95 Theses on a church door in what is present-day Germany. At the same time as those things are going on, Magellan is trying to circumnavigate the globe. The point here is that these two topics definitely overlap. And so if you've reviewed Unit 1, you probably heard some Reformation-y concepts. And as we talk about the Reformation, you might hear some Renaissance or exploration kind of things because there's definitely an overlap between those things. So today, right now, we're going to be studying just topic number 2.1, Contextualizing 16th and 17th century challenges and developments. I like to always remind my students that when you are writing for the AP test, it is really important to be able to use evidence from the right time period. I don't think you ever have to memorize exact dates, but you do have to be able to place people, ideas, and concepts within a century, 100-year chunk of time. So when we say 16th century, we mean, of course, 1500s. When we say 17th century, we mean 1600s, and that clearly is falling within the time frame. And we're going to talk about some of the challenges and developments. But this first topic is always the contextualization. I think this is another good chance to kind of point out that there are, in this class, 6 critical historical thinking skills. The AP test isn't just about content. It's also about your ability to take ideas and conceptual thematic principles and show that you have a brain, show that you can prove understanding on those things. And so there are 6 skills that we've been trying to develop throughout this year. If you have not developed these skills, it will show in your writing. If you haven't developed these skills, you won't have the strong writing that you need to pass the AP exam. Those 6 skills are development and processes, showing how history develops over time, and the processes that make things happen or encourage things to happen. The second skill is sourcing and citation, being able to take a document and source it and cite it properly and use it in your writing. Use it as evidence. Obviously, we've been trying to teach students throughout this entire year that whenever you write something in a historical sense, you need to do 3 basic things. You need to make a claim. If you don't make a claim, then you can't make an argument. Okay? If you make a claim, you have to back it up with evidence. And this evidence can come from different places. Sometimes the evidence is provided for you in a document, but sometimes the evidence has to come from what you learn in class, what you studied from the textbook, what you learned from watching YouTube videos on topics or reviewing these study guides. Okay? And of course, when we say claim evidence, we also always tie in reasoning. And in history, there's three basic ways that you can use reasoning, okay, to make connections in the content. And that's to compare and contrast something, to show cause and effect, or to show continuity and change over time. The last skill, of course, is that contextualization piece, and that ties us right into the unit that we're studying right here, contextualizing the 16th and 17th century challenges and developments. The first learning objective right here, A, says, explain the context in which the religious, political, and cultural developments of the 16th and 17th century took place. So we have to have some background on religion, and we have to have some background on politics and the culture of the time, or we won't truly understand the Age of Reformation. And that's something that's really clear whenever you take a class. The more background information you have on stuff, the more sense your teacher makes. If I start talking about religion today, and I start to assume that everybody knows the basic world religions, then we might have a problem. People might not be on the same page as I am. For instance, in this first bullet point, it says, religious pluralism challenged the concept of a unified Europe. In my mind, I'm going back and I'm thinking of Europe at this time period. And in my brain, I already know that the people who were living in Western Europe, there was really only one kind of Christian church in Western Europe. And quite frankly, there wasn't a lot of religious pluralism that was going on in Europe at the time. There were some Muslims, but for the most part, by this point, Muslims had been kicked out of Europe and forced to retreat back into North Africa. So knowing that North Africa is very Islamic at the time helps us to understand what's going on in Europe. Also, there was a giant Muslim empire that's being formed during this time period called the Ottoman Empire. It was centered in the modern-day country of Turkey, but it was slowly encroaching into southern Europe. Okay, and it extended way beyond the modern-day boundaries of Turkey. That's the Ottoman Empire. So there's an Islamic influence over here in the east, and quite frankly, there was some Islamic influence over here in the western part until the final pieces of the Reconquista in Spain, as Christians reconquered Spain in the name of Christianity. And there was this overarching idea that all Christians shared a bond, but there had been divisions in the past that had happened in Christianity. So even though there was one basic type of Christian church in Western Europe, the Catholic Church, we know that in Eastern Europe there was a different form of Christianity, and that had happened back several centuries before this class started. So those are some of the pieces of context that need to be laid out. And to be honest, that's one of the first things that I did in this class as I taught students about the Reformation. I tried to lay down some basic context, to lay down some things that students needed to know before we got into the Reformation. You have to understand the basics of Christianity. So you can go back to your notes in class, and what you'd find is that back in 1054 AD, Christianity splits. Both of the leaders of the Eastern Christian Church and the leaders of the Western Christian Church excommunicated each other. And this goes back to the old Roman Empire. When Rome split, the West fell apart into medieval Europe, and the East remained a powerful, unified Roman Empire that in history we call the Byzantine Empire. And because Rome split at almost the same time as it was adopting Christianity, because it split, then Christianity is over time going to split. These two things don't happen at the same time. Rome splits, the West falls apart, the East stays strong, but over time they start to evolve on different paths. And so we get the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox in the East. And so this is what we sometimes call the Great Schism. This word, Great Schism, is actually used for different schisms. That's kind of an unfortunate thing because that makes it confusing for history students. But generally this is called the Great Schism or the East-West Schism. And that's some of the things about contextualization that you want to remember. If you're going to get into this age of Reformation, you have to know a fair bit of stuff about Christianity. One of the things that I try to remind my students is that Christianity has its roots in the Jewish faith. What that means is, if you look at the Holy Bible, there are two parts of the Holy Bible. There's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament. And within the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Testament is focused just on Jewish writings. So all of the people that wrote in there were Jewish. The New Testament starts to tell the story of a Jewish man named Jesus, who takes the Jewish teachings and sends it in a different direction. Of course, creating this new idea of Christianity. I also, later on, tried to talk about just understanding the basics of world religion as they exist in the world today. Again, this provides us with a little bit of context to understanding Christianity and its place in the rest of the world. If you look at this map of the world right here, it's color coordinated by different religions. And there's different forms of Christianity. So I'm going to blow this map up here for a second so that we can take a look at it. And if we take a look at it right here, everything you see in purple is predominantly Christian. But there are different kinds of Christianity. Okay? If we look at this green color here in the key, this tells us that this is the predominant Islamic part of the world today. Judaism is not a huge world religion, but its impact has been significant. So there's not a huge number of Jews in the world, but they have a huge impact, especially because it influences later Christianity. You can see, of course, there's a religion of Hindu that's very predominant in India, in South Asia. And then there's Buddhism that we would find in parts of Asia. In today's world, there are even parts that are extremely non-religious. China has a hugely impacted by Confucianism and Buddhism and something called Taoism. But today, because it's a communist country, it's very non-religious. Communism is almost cohesive with atheism. That's something that's been, played out over time in history that we'll talk about later. This map right here breaks it down in a different way. It tells us the same information, but it kind of separates Christianity into its different pieces. You can see that the purplish colors are Catholic, right, or Catholic Church. So anywhere that Spain takes over is going to be predominantly Catholic, okay, and huge chunks of Europe are still predominantly Catholic. But there's also the Orthodox, and so anything in Eastern Europe that is Christian is going to be of the Orthodox brand. And of course, the other key piece of Christianity is Protestantism. And you notice places like the United States, Australia, places where England takes over, okay, that speak English, are going to be very Protestant. And so in the United States, even though the United States is a predominantly Christian country, it, of course, is of the brand of Protestantism. You'll notice that most religions have a split, like even within Islam, there are two different main types of Muslims, Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. You'll find that's true of most religions, like even Buddhism. You'll find there's also a major split. So those are some of the pieces of the puzzle that we wanted to talk about. And as we go through this, we're going to be talking about Christianity in general. And so we're going to be talking about the different types of Christians and how they came to be. And what we need to see is there is a direct connect between some of the different religions. So when I say Christianity, I'm referring to Catholics and Protestants and the Orthodoxy. There are some other types of Christians that would fall out of those three categories, but as you can clearly see, that's the dominant forms of Christianity. I sometimes hear students ask questions that aren't very academically accurate. I've heard students say, "Oh, are you a Catholic or are you a Christian?" And they clearly don't understand that Catholics are some of the original Christians. And when they say Christian, they mean Protestant Christians. And so that's really what this whole unit was about, trying to help us understand how we get to modern Christianity and some of the context that's laid out in order to understand what we're talking about. And so one last thing that I'd like to point out before we get back to the study guide is kind of showing you the interconnectedness of some of the major religions of the world. In Western civilization, and that's what this class focuses on, Western civilization, Judaism is one religion by itself. Okay, it's a completely unique religion. Christianity is a separate religion, but there is some overlap. As I just pointed out, Jesus himself was Jewish, and he grew up with Jewish traditions and Jewish holidays and learning about Jewish prophets. So there is an overlap between Judaism and Christianity. There's another religion called Islam. The followers are Muslim. And even though it's a completely separate religion from Judaism and Christianity, if you go and look at the holy writings of Islam, which are found in the Quran, then you would read stories about Adam and Noah and Moses and Abraham. And you would even read a story about a virgin who gives birth to a baby named Jesus who becomes a great prophet. That's in the story of Islam. So it's a very different religion, but there is some overlap, and that's what this little Venn diagram is supposed to show you. Completely separate religions, but they do have some core beliefs that are the same. The same would be true if you went to the eastern side of the world, over into Asia. There are two distinct religions of Hinduism and Buddhism, but the original guy who started Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, he becomes the Buddha, but he was trained by Hindu holy men. And so there is some overlap in Eastern religions as well. But there's definitely a clear divide between the two. Keeping that in mind, in my notes I did provide some key contextualization for students. This kind of stuff would not be asked on an AP test, but it does give you some background information on what's really important if you want to understand Christianity as a whole. One of the first questions that I ask students in my class is, what year do they think it is? And it kind of sounds like a stupid question because everybody knows what year it is, right? You just pull out your phone, you look at it, it's like a duh. Everybody knows that. But what a lot of students don't understand is how Christian our culture is, whether you're a Christian or not. Any date that you have, say it's the year 2020, what that means is 2020 years AD, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. That's 2020 years since Jesus was born. That's the zero marker on the timeline. And so if you want to go back and read this, in our notes, this covers some key things that happened in Christianity before the age of Reformation. Things that are of note, some of the most important dates in Christianity is, of course, the birth of Jesus, generally celebrated around Christmas time, although there's historical debate as to when he was really born. It's pretty clear that the Emperor Constantine picked a pagan ritual that was already set. around the winter solstice right there to kind of celebrate a Christian celebration. But nonetheless, that's what Christians do, is celebrate Christmas as the birth of Jesus. Then, of course, there's the death of Christ, and that, of course, is celebrated around Easter time. That coincides with the Jewish Passover always. So the date of Christmas never changes, but the date of Easter always changes because it's based on a different calendar than the Christian calendar. It's based off the Jewish calendar. It always follows with Passover, and that's a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. There is the Council of Nicaea, when the Emperor Constantine gets people together to talk out Christian doctrine, and it's where they form the whole doctrine of modern Christianity, and it's where Rome officially starts to take Christianity on as its official religion, and thus ties Christianity to the Roman Empire. Of course, the Roman Empire falls apart, and thus Christianity is going to, over time, diverge into two pieces. One of the other things that was really important that happened in Christianity was on Christmas Day in the year 800 AD, when Charlemagne, he forms the Holy Roman Empire. And historians differ as to who really started the Holy Roman Empire, but this guy Charlemagne, there's no doubt, is probably the most important medieval king in all of Europe. Was he French or was he German is a hotly debated concept. But that's a story for a different time. But what we do need to know is that Charlemagne becomes the defender of Christianity, and he forms what's called the Holy Roman Empire. And this is totally different than the Roman Empire. It's really what we would think of as modern day Germany today and some of the surrounding areas. There's an east-west schism, sometimes called the Great Schism, when the church divides between Catholics in the west and Orthodox in the east. And slowly after that, Christians go on a crusade to retake the Holy Land from Muslims. The two things that happen right before this class begins, the Avignon Papacy. This is a reminder that the Pope, that's the head of the Catholic Church, he has headquarters in Rome. And today it's called the Vatican. It's the world's smallest country. But for about 70 years, the King of France took the popes over to a place called Avignon in southern France. And so people started to see the Pope as a puppet of the French kings. And that totally, people started not respecting the Pope's authority as much. They saw him just as a puppet of the French king. And so this is one of those things that starts to break people's confidence in the papacy or the Pope. When the Pope returns back to Rome after about 70 years, and there were several popes, so it wasn't 70 years, one pope. There was multiple popes in Avignon. But when the popes return to Rome, they elect a new pope, and some people don't like this new pope, and so they elect another one. And so there's a time period where there's two popes at the same time. And even for a short time, there was a third pope elected. And having three popes, or at least two at the same time, you can see how that could cause some serious problems. And people call that the Western Schism. Unfortunately, they also sometimes call that the Great Schism, but just to confuse people. I tried to distinguish the East-West Schism and the Western Schism. And that's where we start to get into the Protestant Reformation, and that's where we're at. I'm going to come back to this study guide here, this key concept study guide, and hit some of these bullet points to make sure we've covered them. The Protestant and Catholic Reformations fundamentally changed theology, religious institutions, culture, and attitude towards wealth and property. So this religious and theological debate that's going to happen within Christianity is going to change culture, and it's going to change people's attitude about how they see the world. And that's true. Religion impacts how we see the world. This next bullet point says religious reform both increased state control of religious institutions and provided justification for challenging state authority. One of the things we talked about was like somebody like Henry VIII, who's going to become the head of the church in his own kingdom, and thus he's going to consolidate both political and religious control. And so you're going to see that he's going to get more control over religious institutions, and that's the prime example right there. Conflicts among religious groups overlapped with political and economic competitions within states. Unfortunately, it's not just a theological debate that's going to happen, but this era of Reformation is going to cause some of the bloodiest wars in the history of Europe, and that's the sad part of this story. It's going to be Christians killing other Christians to prove which Christian church is right, and that's the sad part of this story right here. They're not acting very Christian-like. European society and the experiences of everyday life were increasingly shaped by commercial and agricultural capitalism, notwithstanding the continued existence of medieval social and economic structures. So in Europe, people, they're still peasants, and there's still manners. Okay, it's almost like there's still medieval times going on, but we're slowly growing out of the medieval times because of Renaissance ideas that are spreading out of Italy to the rest of Europe. And at the same time, because of increased literacy and because of the printing press, ideas are going to spread. And because the Renaissance encouraged people to challenge things, people are going to start challenging church doctrine and church practices and church corruption. And that's how those two things are going to be interrelated. European society and the experience of everyday life were increasingly shaped by that capitalism. And again, that's that whole idea. People are always driven by economic principles. Perhaps this is one more little side note, that there are in this class seven overarching themes. And these themes will be covered in all of the time periods. It's not like it just covered in one of the time periods. From 1450 all the way to 1648, these are the 7 overarching themes of the class. And so economics is one of them. One of them is government, right? One of them is geography. One of them is technology and science, right? These are overarching, One of them is looking at society and culture, cultural kind of things, like artistic and intellectual movements. So we look at philosophers and art movements over time, and those things are embedded into this class. As we finish off this first video here, reviewing, please remember at any time, if you'd rather just go and read and dig on the internet on your own, you're always welcome to pause this video at any time and do that. My point here is to take this stuff and help bring it to light, and to help you understand it maybe better than just reading it for yourself. But I will go ahead and finish up this little outline here on topic 2.1. So population shifts and growing commerce cause the expansion of cities, which often places stress on their traditional political and social structures. The family remained the primary social and economic institution of early modern Europe, and took several forms, including the nuclear family. It's interesting when we say the word family, people have different perspectives and point of views. That's one of the skills in this class, is to be able to look at things from different point of views and kind of maybe break what you see as the truth and help you see things from other people's point of views. That's one of the purposes of this class. Popular culture, leisure activities and rituals reflecting the continued popularity of folk ideas reinforced and sometimes challenged communal ties and norms. So that's what's going to happen in this age of Reformation. I'm going to go back to this word, Reformation. The point of the Reformation is going to be to try to fix problems that people see in the Christian church, and specifically the Catholic Church. This Reformation is not going to affect the Orthodox Church. Okay, when the Reformation begins, there's really just the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. And when it's all done, millions of people are going to be dead, and there's going to be a third type of Christianity. The struggles for sovereignty within and among states resulted in varying degrees of political centralization. The new concept of sovereign state and secular systems of law played a central role in the creation of new political institutions. And that really brings us back to the point where we started, that in this class we're going to cover these concepts, and I'll go back to this just one more time here. Right now we're focusing on Unit 2, and we're going to be focusing on topic 2.1 here, just laying down some of the background to help students understand the Age of Reformation. Thanks for joining me. This is Mr. Moore signing off with this unit review.